Police officer rescues black baby. Found in the trash but years later receives heartbreaking news. Part 1. It was a cold November night when Officer Robert Parker heard a faint sound during his usual patrol around Oakview Estate. The rain was falling steadily, making the streets glisten under the dim streetlights. Robert had been a police officer for 15 years in the small town of Millfield, and most nights were quiet affairs. The noise came again, a weak cry that seemed out of place in the empty car park behind the local shops. Robert turned his torch toward the large bins at the far end. Something told him to investigate further. As he moved closer to the bins, the crying became clearer. Robert's heart beat faster. He lifted the lid of one bin and shone his light inside. There, wrapped in a thin, wet blanket among the rubbish, was a tiny baby. The dark-skinned infant couldn't have been more than a few hours old. "Oh my God," Robert whispered, carefully lifting the small bundle. The baby boy was cold to the touch, his lips slightly blue. Robert quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around the child, then rushed back to his police car. "This is Officer Parker," he said urgently into his radio. "I found an abandoned newborn baby. Need an ambulance at the Oakview Shops car park right away." While waiting for the ambulance, Robert held the baby close to his chest, trying to warm him. "You're going to be all right," he said softly, though his voice shook with emotion. "I've got you now, you're safe." At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to treat the baby for cold and hunger. Robert stood by, unable to leave. The tiny boy had no name, no identity, no one in the world who seemed to care if he lived or died. No one except Robert. "Will he be okay?" Robert asked Dr. Mary Thompson, who nodded. "He's a fighter," she said, "but what happens next is up to social services." Over the next few days, Robert found himself returning to the hospital after his shifts. He would sit beside the baby's cot and talk to him softly. Sometimes he would read from the newspaper or just tell the child about his day. Robert had never married. At 42, he lived alone in a small flat above the old bookshop in town. His life was simple: work, football on weekends, dinner with his brother's family on Sundays. But something about this abandoned child touched him deeply. On the 5th day, Robert arrived to find Jane Williams, the social worker, making notes beside the baby's cot. "Officer Parker," she greeted him with a small smile. "I should have known you'd be here." "Any word on his family?" Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. Jane shook her head. "No one has come forward. Once he's strong enough, he'll go into emergency foster care until we can find a permanent placement." Robert watched the baby sleeping peacefully, small hands curled into fists. The child had no idea that big decisions were being made about his future, decisions that would shape his whole life. "What would I need to do?" Robert said suddenly, surprising himself, "to become his foster parent?" Jane looked up from her notes, clearly surprised. "That's a big step, Officer Parker, especially for a single man with a demanding job. And there are other considerations like cross-cultural adoption." "I can learn," Robert said firmly, a new certainty in his voice. "I can take family leave. I can do whatever I need to do." As he spoke the words, Robert knew they were true. In saving this child from the rubbish bin, something had awakened in him, a purpose, a connection he couldn't explain. "His name is James," Robert said, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "James Parker," Jane nodded slowly. "I'll get you the paperwork to start the process, but I have to warn you it won't be easy." Robert looked at the sleeping child who had already changed his life in just 5 short days. "The best things never are," he replied. Part 2. The next 6 weeks moved quickly for Robert Parker. His small flat above the bookshop suddenly filled with baby items: a cot, tiny clothes, bottles, and nappies. His sister-in-law Helen helped him shop, laughing at his confusion over baby grows and sleep suits. "You really sure about this, Rob?" his brother William asked one evening as they assembled the cot. "It's a huge step." Robert nodded, thinking of little James waiting in the hospital. "I've never been more sure of anything." The social services panel interview was difficult. 5 serious-faced people sat across from Robert, asking hard questions about his work hours, support system, and understanding of transracial adoption. Mr. Parker, raising a black child as a white man comes with responsibilities you may not have considered, said one panel member. How will you ensure James grows up with a strong sense of his cultural identity? Robert had prepared for this. I've joined a support group for adoptive parents. I've been reading books about transracial adoption. My neighbor, Mrs. Foster, who's Jamaican, has offered to help. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to making sure James knows who he is and where he comes from. After 2 long hours, Jane Williams walked him out. You did well, she said, but I want to be honest. The panel has concerns about your work schedule. Robert had thought about this too. I've spoken to my inspector. I can move to day shifts and community liaison work. Less overtime, regular hours. 2 weeks later, Robert got the call. He had been approved as an emergency foster parent for James. The adoption process would take longer, but this was the first step. The day he brought James home was both terrifying and wonderful. The baby seemed so small in the car seat. Robert drove home at exactly 5 miles below the speed limit, checking the rearview mirror at every traffic light. Mrs. Foster from the flat next door was waiting when they arrived. She had knitted a blue blanket for James and made a casserole for Robert. Every new parent needs help, she said firmly, showing Robert how to test the temperature of the milk on his wrist. The first night was the hardest. James woke every 2 hours, crying. Robert stumbled around in the dark, making bottles, changing nappies, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. By morning, his eyes were red with tiredness, but when James looked up at him and gripped his finger with a tiny hand, Robert felt a wave of love unlike anything he'd known before. Days turned into weeks. Robert learned to function on little sleep. He discovered that James liked to be rocked while Robert hummed old Beatles songs. He found that bathing a squirming baby was like trying to wash a slippery fish. There were difficult moments. Once, in the supermarket, an elderly woman peered into the pram and asked, "Where's his real mummy then?" Robert had been too shocked to reply. His brother's family visited often. William's children, Peter and Lucy, were fascinated by their new cousin. Lucy, at 10 years old, appointed herself James's special protector. "He's going to need me to tell him about important stuff," she announced, "like which teachers at school are nice and which ones are grumpy." Robert returned to work after 12 weeks, with James going to the nursery at the community center. His colleagues noticed a change in him. He smiled more, talked more, shared photos of James's first attempts at rolling over. 6 months after finding James in the bin, Robert sat in his solicitor's office, signing the formal adoption application. Papers. It's still going to take time, the solicitor warned, and there could be challenges. Robert thought about the sleeping baby waiting at home, about the tiny socks he'd paired that morning, about the way James's face lit up when he saw Robert after work. "He's my son," Robert said simply. "We'll face whatever comes together." Part 3. The years passed quickly as James grew from a baby into a little boy. By his 5th birthday, the adoption was final, and he was officially James Robert Parker. The small flat above the bookshop had become too small for their growing family, so Robert bought a modest house with a garden near the local primary school. James was a bright, curious child with an infectious laugh. He loved football, dinosaurs, and asking endless questions about how things worked. Robert treasured their bedtime routine. Bath, story, and then James's nightly questions that ranged from, "Why is the sky blue?" to, "Do fish get thirsty?" When James started school, Robert made sure to be actively involved. He joined the parent committee, volunteered at sports days, and never missed a parents' evening. The teachers commented on how confident and happy James was, a testament to the stable home Robert had created. It wasn't always easy. When James was 7, he came home from school unusually quiet. Robert found him sitting on his bed looking at his hands. "What's wrong, mate?" Robert asked, sitting beside him. James looked up with worried eyes. "Tommy said you can't be my real dad because we don't look the same." Robert felt his heart squeeze. He had been preparing for this conversation, but it still hurt to see the confusion on his son's face. "Come here," he said, pulling James onto his lap. "Families come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some children grow in their mom's tummy, and some like you grow in their dad's heart. You didn't grow in my tummy, but you've been growing in my heart since the day I found you." "Found me?" James asked, suddenly curious. Robert took a deep breath. He had always planned to be honest with James about his beginnings, in age-appropriate ways. "Yes. When you were just a tiny baby, I found you. You needed someone to love you and take care of you, and I needed someone to love and take care of. We found each other exactly when we needed to." James thought about this for a moment. "Like when I found Rocket?" he asked, referring to the stray cat they had adopted the previous summer. Robert smiled. "A bit like that, yes. And now we're a family. Different looks, same love." James nodded, seemingly satisfied. He hopped off Robert's lap and went to get his football. "Can we practice in the garden before dinner?" As James grew older, Robert made sure he had black role models in his life. Mrs. Foster became like a grandmother to James. Robert's colleague Marcus often took James to football matches. James joined a community group for transracial adoptive families, where he met other children with similar stories. By the time James was 10, he was a confident, happy boy who understood his unique start in life. He was proud of his black heritage and equally proud of his dad. One evening, as they walked home from football practice, James suddenly took Robert's hand, something he had recently decided he was too grown up for. "Dad," he said seriously, "Tommy's mom and dad are getting divorced. He's really sad." "That must be hard for him," Robert replied. James nodded, then looked up at Robert. "I'm glad you're my dad, even if we don't match on the outside." Robert squeezed the small hand in his. "We match where it counts, James, right here," he said, touching his heart. That night, after James was asleep, Robert sat looking through the photo albums documenting their life together. From the tiny baby in the hospital cot to the confident boy who had just lost his first tooth, James had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined on that rainy night all those years ago. Part 4. 7 more years passed, and James became a teenager. At 17, he had grown taller than Robert, with a lean, athletic build that made him a star on the school football team. His bedroom walls were covered with posters of famous footballers and musicians. Robert sometimes stood in the doorway, amazed at how quickly his son had grown up. James was in his final year at school now, with good marks and plans to study sports science at university. Robert couldn't have been prouder of the thoughtful, confident young man his son had become. One evening after dinner, as they washed up together, James brought up a subject that had been on his mind. "Dad, I've been thinking about trying to find information about my birth parents," he said, carefully drying a plate. "Not because I'm unhappy or anything, just to know where I come from." Robert paused, his hands still in the soapy water. He had expected this conversation eventually, had prepared for it, but it still made his heart beat faster. "That's completely normal, James," he said calmly. "I've kept all the paperwork from the adoption. There wasn't much information about your birth parents, but what I have is in the filing cabinet. We can look whenever you're ready." James nodded, relief clear on his face. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe this weekend?" That Saturday, they sat at the kitchen table with the thin folder of documents. There wasn't much, just the police report from the night. Robert found James and notes from the social services investigation that had failed to locate his birth parents. "So there's no way to find them?" James asked, disappointment clear in his voice. "It might be difficult," Robert admitted. "But when you turn 18, you can register with the Adoption Contact Register. And there are DNA ancestry services now. That might help." James nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to try that. Not that you're not enough," he added quickly. "You're the best dad anyone could ask for. I just wonder sometimes, you know." "I know," Robert said, squeezing his son's shoulder, "and I'll support you however I can." 2 months later, James received exciting news. He had been offered a sports scholarship to a good university. The whole family celebrated with a special dinner, and Robert gave James a gift, a new laptop for his studies. The following week, James began experiencing severe headaches. At first, Robert thought it was the stress of exams and excitement about university. But when James woke up one night crying in pain, Robert rushed him to the hospital. After several tests, Dr. Wilson asked to speak with Robert privately. "We found something concerning in James's blood work," the doctor said seriously. "There are indicators of a rare genetic condition called Mason-Lambert syndrome. It's hereditary, passed down through families." Robert felt his stomach drop. "Is it serious?" "It can be if left untreated, but the good news is with early intervention, patients can live normal lives. We need to do more specific genetic testing to confirm the diagnosis." Robert nodded, trying to take in this information. "What causes it?" "It's a recessive genetic condition," the doctor explained. "Both parents must carry the gene for a child to develop it, which is why," he added, looking uncomfortable, "we found something else you should know." Robert waited, a strange feeling crawling up his spine. "The genetic markers in James's blood work match a profile in our national database," Dr. Wilson said gently. "Someone who registered as looking for a child given up in circumstances that match James's story. It appears that his birth mother has been searching for him." Robert gripped the edge of the chair, his world suddenly spinning. After 17 years, James's past had finally caught up with them. Part 5. Robert sat alone in the hospital waiting room, his mind racing. After 17 years, James's birth mother had appeared through a random genetic match. What would this mean for them, for the family they had built together? When James woke up, Robert knew he had to tell him everything. His son listened quietly as Robert explained about the genetic condition and the unexpected match. "So she's been looking for me?" James asked, his voice small. "All this time?" "It seems that way," Robert replied carefully. "The doctor says her name is Elizabeth Fletcher. She registered with the genetic database 5 years ago, hoping to find the baby she lost." James was silent for a long moment. "Lost? Not abandoned?" Robert took his son's hand. "We don't know the full story yet. The doctor said she's agreed to meet us if you want that." 2 days later, a nervous woman with kind eyes and dark skin similar to James's entered the hospital room. Elizabeth was 33 now, dressed simply, in jeans and a blue cardigan, her hands trembling slightly as she saw James for the first time since his birth. "You look like your grandfather," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Over the next hour, Elizabeth shared her story. She had been 16 when she got pregnant, frightened and alone. Her boyfriend at the time, James's biological father, had pressured her to hide the pregnancy from her strict parents. "When you came early, we weren't prepared," she explained. "I had you alone in Michael's flat. There were complications and I passed out from blood loss. When I woke up in hospital the next day, Michael told me our baby hadn't survived." Robert listened in shocked silence as Elizabeth continued. "I believed him for years, until his sister finally told me the truth when we ran into each other at a shop. Michael had panicked when I passed out. He wrapped you up and left you, then lied to me. By the time I learned the truth, he had moved away, and I had no idea where to look for you." James's treatment for Mason-Lambert syndrome began immediately. The early diagnosis meant he had an excellent chance for a full recovery. Elizabeth, who worked as a nurse, understood the medical details better than Robert and helped explain everything to James. As the weeks passed, Robert watched James and Elizabeth build a careful relationship. She had married and had 2 daughters, James's half-sisters who were eager to meet their big brother. Robert tried to be supportive, but at night, alone in his house, he wrestled with a fear he couldn't shake, that he might lose the son he had raised. One evening, James found him, sitting in the garden, lost in thought. "Dad, you okay?" James asked, sitting beside him. Robert forced a smile. "Just thinking." James was quiet for a moment. "You're worried about Elizabeth and her family, aren't you?" Robert looked at his son, this young man who had always been able to read him so well. "It's a lot of change," he admitted. "For both of us." "Dad," James said firmly, "finding Elizabeth doesn't change anything between us. You're my father. You're the one who found me, who wanted me, who taught me to ride a bike and tie my shoes. That doesn't go away. Robert blinked back tears. I just want what's best for you. I know, James said. And now I have more family who care about me. But you'll always be my dad. 6 months later, James's health had improved dramatically with treatment. He started university as planned, with regular visits home to see Robert and occasional weekends with Elizabeth's family. On Father's Day, James gave Robert a photo album. Inside were pictures of their life together, and on the final page, a recent photo of all of them: Robert, James, Elizabeth and her husband, and James's half-sisters, all smiling together. The card read, "To my dad, who taught me that family isn't about blood or matching looks. It's about love and choosing each other every day. Thank you for choosing me."